morning. It's Friday, November 11th, Veterans Day, and I'm happy to report that Lee Zeldin finally conceded the election. It took him 12 hours to concede, and I can understand why. He probably felt that he had a really good chance of winning, and based upon the election results, he probably was right to think that. Even though he lost by 293,000 votes, he carried 49 of New York's 62 counties. So when you look at the map of New York, you see huge amounts of red and one or two large amounts of blue and a couple of small splotches on the thing. But those splotches carried many more voters than the rest of the state. And that is a reflection of the map of the United States. New York's distribution of votes is no different than any other of the states in this country. The large population areas, the cities, and the rural counties have distinct characteristics. In the rural counties, I believe that the population is not diverse for the most, but in the cities, diversity exists. And therefore, the cities tend to be less afraid of what's coming down the road. They have less, I won't call it hatred. I don't want to call it hate, but they care less about the color of your skin and the religion that you propose to support. So that's what this country is all about. New York is a reflection of the entire country. So if you have places in this country where there are no really large cities, then you will have a very, very predominantly Republican population. That's all I want to say about the elections. Let's talk about Veterans Day. Today is Veterans Day. So let's look a little bit at the history of this day. The very first celebration of Veterans Day occurred in Birmingham, Alabama in 1947. It was organized by a veteran whose name was Raymond Weeks, and he was a World War II veteran, and he organized the National Veterans Day, which included a parade and other festivities to honor all veterans. And the event happened to be held on November 11th, which in those days was designated as Armistice Day. And that goes back to World War I. Now, I'm sure most of you out there know the story associated with World War I and Armistice Day, but I'm not sure that our grandchildren know it. I'm not sure they teach it quite the same way these days. In any event, I'll take you back quickly. World War I was known at the time as the Great War. It officially ended when the Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, at the Palace of Versailles, which was outside of the town of Versailles, naturally. And that was in France. But the fighting really had stopped 7 months prior to that. Actually, the fighting had stopped on November 11th, 1918. And the Allied powers and the Germans decided that they call the end of this war on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And at that time it became Armistice Day. And I'm sure, as you remember, as I remembered, that Armistice Day fell on November 11th, and that's the day you celebrated. In November 1919, President Wilson proclaimed November 11th as the first commemoration of Armistice Day with the following words: "To us in America, the reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service." So here we are, 104 years later. And when we look back at those 104 years later, we see that what was thought about in 1918 and 1919, the end of all wars, etc., we see how wrong that was. We see how this world has changed, and how many times the United States has gone to fight for some cause. It's a disgrace in my mind, somehow, that we have had to fight so many wars. Now, I grant you that World War II was a necessary evil, and we had to fight that war. That should have been the war that ended all wars. But it wasn't. We end up in Korea, we end up in Vietnam, we end up in Afghanistan, all of which have been a blight on our image, I think, around the world. Because we achieved very little in those fights. The end result of those fights did not help this world as much as many would have hoped for. This world is a place in turmoil, and we view now the episode in the Ukraine, which is something that could lead to another world fiasco. But so far we have maintained a position of help, not fighting with our troops, but help. And I am not sure necessarily that I agree with this passive approach to the Ukrainian situation. I believe that Russia has to suffer some way, shape, or form. And I feel sorry for the people in Russia. I feel sorry for them because they have been following a misguided person for many, many years. A person who we know has attempted through acolytes and associates to do damage to the United States' government and election systems. So I think if we ended up helping Ukraine in a more positive way, we would be doing ourselves a favor. But we don't want to risk that kind of situation. And basically, we are looking at a sick man who has nuclear weapons at his disposal. But beyond that, he has many who agree with him. Many nations have not taken up the cause of Ukraine. It's a screwed up world we live in. And there are many important things that have to be done. And it is very difficult to get them properly organized. And so while Veterans Day was a representation, no more battles, no more wars, it failed. And I don't think there really should be any celebration at the end of any war, because it seems to me that war is a way of life in humanity. So I leave you with those unpleasant thoughts this morning, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.